One day in January of 2018, a police officer walked through the woods near the small town of Gray, France. And as he walked, he was looking at the ground because he was following a literal trail of blood. And this trail eventually led the officer to the body of a person who clearly had been shot in the head. Now, this appeared to be a suicide, but the police officer had some questions because this was not the first body that had been found in these woods near the small town in France. Another body had been found a couple of months earlier, and it was starting to seem like there was a pattern here. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you make coffee for the like button, don't use a coffee filter so there's just a ton of grinds in their drink. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At around 5 p.m. on the evening of October 27, 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval drove her car down a cul-de-sac in the small, quiet town of Gray, France. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's second birthday, and it was going to be this big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had come in all the way from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away. But Alexia realistically had mixed feelings about seeing them all tonight. So Alexia had been going through a pretty hard time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant, and so she'd done several rounds of fertility treatments, which had thrown her hormones completely out of whack and seemed to affect her a lot more than was typical for most women. And then finally, when all that had led to her actually getting pregnant, she unfortunately had miscarried just a couple of months ago. And so even though Alexia loved her sister's family and got along with them really well, her miscarriage was still really fresh in her mind, and she just knew it was going to be very difficult for her to be around her young nephew. It was just a reminder of what she had lost. Now, Alexia came to a stop outside of a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac, and she rang the intercom. And then when the gate opened up, she drove up the driveway toward a nice house with a very well-kept garden. She parked her car in the driveway behind her father's white van, and then got out of her car. She grabbed a wrapped present out of the back seat, along with a couple of desserts that she'd made, carried them up to the house, and rang the doorbell. And a few seconds later, her mother, Isabelle Fouillot, answered the door with a big smile and led her into the dining room where Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, sat at the table, talking with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and also her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and they greeted her, and then as Alexia began to explain that her husband Jonathan was running late and he'd be here later in a separate car because the job he'd been working that day as an electrician had run long, as she was saying all that, Alexia heard the sound of little feet making their way towards her. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his arms around Alexia's legs. And surprisingly, to Alexia's relief, she didn't feel sadness. All she felt was happiness. And so she bent down and scooped him up and gave the boy a big hug, and then she also handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the group settled in for dinner, and for a while, all of Alexia's worries just kind of faded away. She was really close with everybody at the table, especially her mother and her sister Stephanie, and being around them always put her in a good mood. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30, and he, along with the rest of the group, had a wonderful night, eating and drinking and chatting. After dinner was cleaned up, Alexia's father did go to bed, but everybody else stayed up, and they all just continued having this nice time until around 11 p.m., when Alexia said it was really time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run in the morning, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She'd left her own car at her parents' house because she'd been drinking, and she was planning to pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was on a quiet residential street, only about a mile away from Alexia's parents' house. And as they made their way down the road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house that was just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, she frowned. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer. He'd been obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't feel safe even going out for a jog around the block when she was by herself. Now, fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't really know how long it would be until he got out again, or if he'd already been released. She didn't know, so it just sort of felt like a reprieve, not a long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. And as Alexia went from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill in the corner of the garage, which had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he said no. Alexia just sighed. It was supposed to be a very cold and gloomy morning the next day, and so it looked like she was going to have to run outside. The following morning, around 11 a.m., Jonathan walked up to the door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. And as he did, he sort of gave a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked where they'd left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried not to show how anxious he felt as Alexia's mother, Isabel, answered the door. And then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she'd seen or heard from her daughter recently. And when Isabel said she had not, Jonathan completely lost his composure. He said that morning Alexia had gone out for a jog, but not come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he'd tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered, and by this point, she should have been home a long time ago, so something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room with very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what the commotion was about. And so Jonathan sort of frantically re-explained the situation and asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so. But they shook their heads and said they hadn't. But Stephanie showed Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning, just to say that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from Alexia. Jonathan was crying at this point, and so Alexia's family tried to assure him that, Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute here, like nothing's going on. I'm sure she's just running late. And Jonathan, he wanted to believe this, but this was completely unusual. Like, this was not normal for Alexia to be gone for this long without being in touch. It just didn't make sense. It was at this point that Jonathan's brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put his hand on Jonathan in a sort of comforting way and just said, look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you and we can literally go look for Alexia together, or at least be together until she comes back. Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful and said, yep, that would be great. And so a couple of minutes later, the two men got in Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan actually navigated him through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could find her. They drove down all the side streets looking for her. And then when they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and began checking the paths leading into the countryside and also the ditches and the banks of the river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. And then eventually, they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house to see if maybe she'd finally come home with an explanation for all this, but she had not come home. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself, and so Gregory, doing his best to stay calm, said, you know what, let's go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there. A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance, where two nurses were taking a cigarette break. Jonathan told these nurses that he was here looking for his wife and that she'd gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now and maybe she's here. So the nurses, who could clearly tell this was an emergency, they put out their cigarettes and went inside to check the register. But a minute later, they came back and told the men that no, Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She was not here. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just said, look, you gotta go to the police. Picture this, you're doing some online shopping, and all of a sudden, you see it. That one product that you've been looking for. You add it to your cart, and as you're filling in your address, you realize you don't have your card anywhere near you. And just when you're about to give up, you see that purple pay button. One tap, and you're checked out in seconds. Shopify's Shop Pay button is used by millions of businesses all around the world, and it's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. It also helps boost conversions, meaning less carts going abandoned and more sales for you. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the entire United States, from household names like Heinz and Mattel to brands that are just getting started. See less carts go abandoned and more sales with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/MrBallen. Go to shopify.com/MrBallen. Again, that is shopify.com/MrBallen. Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline P.O. sat across from Jonathan in a room at the Gray police station as he explained what had happened with his wife, that she was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running. Bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket, so pretty easy to spot. And then after describing her and sort of realizing the weight of what he was here for, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, as he had been doing much of the morning. Now, P.O. could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset here, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head and said no, and said that overall his wife was very happy and definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he said she had been taking hormones for fertility, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. Or in other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses, where she wouldn't even know what she was doing when she was doing it. It was like she had become this different person. P.O. nodded and just listened to Jonathan and wrote down everything he was saying. And then when he was done, she followed up and said, can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia? And for a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told P.O. that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arnaud, and he'd been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number, and had actually talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said, he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. P.O. was obviously very intrigued by this. And so after this interview was over with Jonathan, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arnaud guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly, they discovered that while Arnaud had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true, he was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Gray Police knocked on the door of Arnaud's mother's house, where Arnaud was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. And when the officer asked if she was Arnaud's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see there was this disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. And he asked the mother if that was Arnaud. And again, the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside, because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arnaud in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute, they both agreed, and the officer came inside. And so the officer went inside the house and sat down in the living room with Arnaud, while Arnaud's mother went to the kitchen to give the men some privacy. And then once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arnaud and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duvall. Arnaud immediately looked down at this question, like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder, and sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, including Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that apparently Arnaud had sent to Alexia that summer, like what was going on with that. And Arnaud admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point, and they'd also hung out in a group setting once, and so him being in touch with her was not totally weird, like they had a real connection. But Arnaud clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did. And that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention, because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, The only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arnaud's phone number. So the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arnaud that Alexia was missing. And then before Arnaud could say anything, the officer asked him where he'd been that morning at 9 a.m. And Arnaud said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arnaud, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive or not. So eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer with sort of a bewildered look on her face that he was here with me all morning. And so at this point, it was clear to the officer that, if the mother was telling the truth here, it would officially rule out Arnaud as a suspect because, he was here. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis because mothers are known to lie, cheat, steal, and do anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Paredes glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Paredes, who was in charge of the investigation. Now, it was still early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every step. Paredes closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and the surrounding woods. Paredes' investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan. But there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They claimed they had all been at the house together. And so without any real leads, Paredes had gotten so desperate for any information that he'd literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Paredes sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. And a moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints actually had turned up something. Paredes listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he'd spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor, that apparently there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Paredes was worried that perhaps this was just like an unfounded rumor, but then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one, and her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, so a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Paredes brought his car to a stop next to a news van parked in the middle of the woods about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so Paredes had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that Paredes was here at the crime scene, he could tell obviously he was late to the game because, a news crew was already here, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. And Paredes was disappointed to see this because he'd hoped that if and when her body was discovered, if she was found dead, at that time he would have had at least one suspect or hopefully multiple suspects identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now he obviously would not get that chance. Paredes sighed, climbed out of his car, and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. Paredes approached one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers around on the ground, and Paredes introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between 2 tree trunks covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Paredes noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Paredes bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face, and there were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Paredes noticed a couple of things that were unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face. And so to Paredes, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Paredes think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia, and not a stranger who simply, accosted her during a jog. Just then, Paredes heard somebody call his name, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. And so Paredes walked over, and the tech showed Paredes what he had just found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Paredes thought, maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Paredes over to them to show him something else they had found: tire tracks in the dirt. Paredes immediately thought about that tip that he had been given about this van with this person driving around town harassing women and girls, and he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved and that these had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. And so as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Paredes made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other persons of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. And so Paredes was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. And so immediately Paredes went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing here. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out here picking mushrooms, but Paredes could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out here. And so, operating on sort of a gut instinct, Paredes pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods outside of town, Paredes sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he just arrested for lurking near the crime scene for no clear reason. And Paredes was pleased. He'd only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really like the first suspect, who was in custody. But as soon as Paredes actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony, and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away, and he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. And so Paredes pressed Anthony to explain then why he was there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain, but what he said was he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he had not been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he'd just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up, and clearly there was something going on, and when Paredes walked over to him, Anthony said he got scared and just lied and said, "Oh, I'm out here picking mushrooms." Like he said it was just embarrassment. And as Paredes sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Paredes followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he'd woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Paredes their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Paredes stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Paredes had no choice but to let Anthony go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. And hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who'd been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect, since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings and his friends, to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he really rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. But so far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. And in fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was like a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but, watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Paredes, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then, all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. Because while they'd been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, January 6th, 2018, Chief Officer Paredes was at his desk, poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head, although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. That can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Paredes looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. Because, a gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be he shot himself and then put the gun in the trash can and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head typically is immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel the 130 feet. It just seemed very unlikely. So now Paredes sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have 2 violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found basically in the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Paredes scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Paredes felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading, and a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. And so the killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up. But it was too late. She was dead. And so now they're really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help, dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out, Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple. But in reality, they'd been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they're having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on January 28, 2018, and 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you two stories that each of them at first glance will appear to be sort of a run-of-the-mill true crime story. But they are not. I promise you, stick to the end of each of these stories and you'll hear two very unique, very sort of unbelievable plot twists. But before we get into those two stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and log on to their computer and email love letters to all of their work contacts. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of April 25th, 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle sat in their police cruiser in the parking lot of a public park in Heilbronn, Germany. They were on their lunch break, and Martin was eating a sandwich and looking out across the park, which was mostly empty because it was a weekday afternoon. So Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and it was generally a pretty safe area. I mean, for the most part, the the worst crimes committed here were like break-ins or muggings. So Martin and his partner, they didn't have a whole lot of action happening around them. However, something Martin and Michelle and basically all police officers, for the most part, in Germany were acutely aware of was over the last 14 years, all across Germany, there had been this rash of crimes ranging from, home invasions and robberies to at least 2 murders that had basically all been committed based on DNA evidence by the same person, this singular woman whose nickname was the woman with no face. And she still hadn't been caught yet. And so in essence, all police officers in Germany were sort of like always on the lookout for this woman. She was like the most elusive and sought after criminal in the whole country. But on this particular day, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about how he might get involved in capturing the woman with no face. Instead, he was just worried about his sandwich. And so he went to take another bite of his sandwich when he heard the back doors of his cruiser open up. And he whipped around and he looked, and there were these 2 people who had approached the cruiser, and each of them were carrying a gun. And before Martin or Michelle could do anything, these people raised their weapons and they fired, and everything went black. Within minutes, officers from the Heilbronn Police Department had swarmed the scene. They found Michelle, who was deceased from a gunshot wound to the head. And Martin had also been shot in the head, but he was still alive. He was just unconscious. And so an ambulance rushed him to the hospital while detectives taped off the crime scene and began looking for evidence. Some officers immediately began canvassing the area looking for potential witnesses. But because the park was basically empty all day, there was nobody who had seen the shooting. Other officers looked for footprints in the ground, around the car. They also began looking for fingerprints on the car, bullet casings, hairs, other fibers inside or outside the car. But there was nothing. And so at this point, the investigators are like, okay, all we know is there's been at least one shooter, maybe multiple, because they have not spoken to Martin, who's unconscious. They have no idea what he's seen. So they're seeing that at least one person has managed to come up to a police cruiser, undetected presumably, open up the doors, shoot both officers in the head, and then get away without leaving behind any obvious evidence. It just seemed crazy. Like, have we just missed something? Like, there's got to be something here that sort of points us in the direction of who was responsible. And so in a last-ditch attempt to find something helpful at the crime scene, one officer swabbed the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. They knew that if there was DNA, it could belong to Martin or Michelle or anybody else who might have been inside of this car, and any of those people didn't have to be the shooter or shooters. They could just be people in the car. But it was possible that DNA found inside that car could belong to whoever did this. However, they wouldn't know about this DNA sample until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that could take a really long time. But it was certainly worth it. And so they sent the swabs off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come in, the Heilbronn PD continued trying to find witnesses or any other helpful evidence, anything, but they kept coming up empty. Their only potential witness here was Martin himself, but he was still in a coma at the hospital. It was not until weeks later that finally the police had something to go on, because the DNA results came back. And not only was there DNA found in the car, but what this DNA revealed sent the media into a frenzy and brought this investigation to the national level. At this time, it's mid-2007, and a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Günther Horn was sitting in his office when he got a call from his boss. And his boss told him, the woman without a face has struck again, this time in Heilbronn. Günther's eyes went wide, and he immediately sat up and listened really intently as his boss explained that 2 police officers in Heilbronn had been shot in the head while parked in their cruiser near this park, and the woman with no face, her DNA had been found in the backseat of their car. Now, Günther had always been fascinated by the woman without a face, so he was ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Günther, would lead the investigation into this most recent crime in Heilbronn that was potentially connected to this woman, and to try to finally identify who she was once and for all. Günther immediately said he would do it, and he got to work. Right away, Günther organized a task force to investigate this woman without a face. The task force was based in Heilbronn, but at Günther's command, detectives on the team began reinvestigating all these crimes from all over Germany that this woman was involved in.
They searched for patterns, for evidence, or witnesses that maybe had been missed during the original investigation. And through this effort, this team was able to come up with a very rough idea of who this woman was. They knew that she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had a lot of criminal contacts because many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But anytime police had interrogated her co-conspirators, they had refused to say anything about her. It was like they were afraid of her. And there were a couple of other details that struck Gunter as being pretty odd. The only evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of these crime scenes was her DNA. And they didn't have a match in the database to pair it with, so they only knew she was a woman, but they didn't know who she was. In 14 years, she never left behind a fingerprint, a footprint, a hair, or anything else. So it seemed like, her crimes were extremely deliberate, very clean, very well planned. But also, she was clearly leaving behind her DNA at all these crime scenes. It almost seemed like that was her calling card. Also, what Gunter and his task force discovered is that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. And this was obviously weird because based on the DNA evidence, they knew unequivocally that their suspect, this woman without a face, was biologically female, not male. And so to Gunter, it seemed like, maybe this man that was being seen at these crime scenes was just one of the woman's co-conspirators, or maybe the woman without a face dressed as a man to avoid being caught. But it was impossible to know without a first-hand witness who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Gunter really needed. And in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Gunter got a call about that exact type of witness that he was looking for. That same day, Gunter walked into a hospital in Heilbronn, and he saw Heilbronn police officer Martin Arnold laying in a hospital bed with his eyes open. He'd been in a coma for a month now after being shot, but he had woken up. And he clearly was Gunter's best chance of catching the woman without a face because presumably before he was shot, he might have gotten a look at her. So he was that witness who might be able to describe her. And so Gunter, he walked over, sat down next to Martin's hospital bed, and he asked him to please tell him everything he remembered about what happened. And Martin, he was very distraught about the whole thing. He's just woken up. He's just learned that his partner has died. And so he's very emotional. But he ultimately tells Gunter that, realistically, he can't really remember what happened. He basically turned around. He saw there was, these two figures. But after he got shot, it was like he just didn't remember anything. And so realistically, Martin had almost nothing to offer, which meant Gunter was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Gunter and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros, clocked thousands of hours of overtime, and even offered a reward equivalent to $400,000 for information. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that the whole time this investigation is going on, the woman without a face kept committing crimes. The task force connected her to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And these crimes weren't even just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. So now the entire region was on alert for this woman who seemed like this impossibly cunning international criminal genius. And Gunter, he couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. According to this officer, the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. They told Gunter that a badly burned body had been found in France, and it was so disfigured that for a while, all police knew was that it was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had come to France had recently been reported missing, and police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork, which included his fingerprints, and they'd been able to lift a DNA profile from those prints. But when they had the DNA analyzed, the results didn't make any sense. And the French police were so baffled by these results that they were now calling Gunter because they knew if there's someone who needs to know about this, it's Gunter. And so Gunter, after being fully filled in about the baffling results that they had found, he was also at first very confused, But at the same time, he felt this new surge of hope, because to him, it felt like, as bizarre as this was, maybe this was the break he'd been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the time he was finally going to figure out who this woman really was. So he thanked the French police officer and then brought this new information to his team. And within just a few days, this new information from France did lead Gunter and his team to the woman with no face. It would turn out this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across the entirety of Germany and beyond, appeared to everybody who actually knew her as a totally normal person. Like, nobody suspected she was actually responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany, who during the day she appeared to work at a factory, and at night she appeared to just go home. Like, she lived a very ordinary life. And so again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that man's fingerprints somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. I mean, primarily because the man was biologically male and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman, that wasn't really possible. And so when the French police saw this, they knew they had to tell Gunter, because he was in charge of the woman without a face investigation. And when he and his team looked into this, they figured out something shocking. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, in particular, her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything she did possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line, helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police use in DNA testing. On any given single shift, this woman would touch hundreds or even thousands of these swabs and would accidentally leave her DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer, woman criminal mastermind parading around the whole country. No, there was just a lot of contaminated cotton swabs. And so in essence, police had wasted all this time, nearly 2 decades, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime, chasing a criminal who didn't exist. It was later determined that the police officer Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders previously attributed to the woman without a face are still unsolved, primarily because police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest embarrassments in German police history. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable, with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her farmhouse in a small village called Bibongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the whole day working outside on her farm, and now all she wanted to do was grab some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a second. But before she could do any of that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the sound of this knock actually sort of energized her, because she was pretty sure that her 16-year-old son, Bak Chung-soo, had finally come home. So Soo-jin and her son ran this farm together, just the two of them. And they really barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So, to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town, and he also frequently did odd jobs in the village for extra cash. The problem was, Soo-jin's son would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by to tell his mother where he was going first. And remember, this was 1930 in rural Korea, so it wasn't like he could just call her. And so basically, this mother was left to worry about her son kind of frequently. And over the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin did, because she had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he did go, days at a time in the past, doing these different odd jobs, this stretch was a pretty long time for him to be gone. But she told herself what must have happened is he must have found work with a family who was, having him work and live with them full time. That this was just a great opportunity and he had taken it, and surely he would be home soon. And now it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was home. So Soo-jin, she rushed to the front door, she opened it up, and the smile on her face faded immediately because it was not her son standing at the door. Instead, it was 2 police officers. And the first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. And Soo-jin told them that, she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality is she didn't know where he was, and he'd been gone for the past week. But don't worry, he wasn't missing. He was very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he'd be home soon. But after she said this, the police looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces and told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief as they told her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy showed he'd been beaten and strangled to death. And for the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people and trying to figure out who this boy was. And based on everything they learned so far, Soo-jin's son was actually the only teenager in the area who wasn't accounted for. But hearing all of this, Soo-jin did not think this could be true. Her son stayed out of trouble and worked really hard. She couldn't imagine why anybody would want to hurt him. So she just told the police, this has got to be a mistake. But the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the 2 police officers. And as they led her through the entrance, down a few hallways, and towards the morgue, she kept telling herself that her son was okay. He was still alive, and this really has to be some sort of horrible mistake. It has to be. But the second she actually walked into the morgue and saw the body lying on the table, her eyes welled up with tears because she knew it was her son. And to Soo-jin, this moment felt like leaving real life and entering a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds, and he was very clearly decomposing. It was just awful to see. But as this mother is sort of just staring down at basically a parent's worst nightmare here, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and she told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were actually not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, the clothes thing felt very important. So she started rattling off ideas for, where they could have come from. It was like her brain suddenly became fixated on this one aspect to avoid touching on the trauma of losing her son. She began telling them that, maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them, or maybe he bought them without her knowing, or maybe whoever killed him dressed him up for some reason. But when she said that last part, it was like all at once, the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her. She started shaking, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case, so she'd just been at the farmhouse all alone, trying to make sense of his death. But now, Soo-jin sees these officers, and so she goes right outside and she meets them and she asks them, do you have news for me about what happened to my son? And they tell her that she was likely going to have to sit down to hear this. Soo-jin figured it couldn't be worse than finding out your son's been murdered, so she said, okay, let's go inside. And so they went inside the farmhouse, they sat down, and then the police told her that they figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not 1, but 2 people in jail right now who had both issued full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Soo-jin's son, Chung-soo, had worked with at the inn in town. One of them was a young man and one was a young woman. And apparently, Chung-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was planning to run away with a different man from the village soon. And Chung-soo had told the married man about it. When the woman found out that Chung-soo had done that, she was furious. So furious that she conspired with her co-worker, the young man, the other suspect, to lure Chung-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then when they got there, the man and the woman beat up Chung-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the first night that Chung-soo had left the farmhouse. So over that 6-day period, he pretty much went out and immediately was killed. And so over those 6 days, he was never, living with a family and working for them. He was just dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Soo-jin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all this, Soo-jin still had one question. What about her son's clothes? Was there anything in the suspect's confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads no, and said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Soo-jin, did feel like the clothes have to mean something, she didn't argue or even, try to come up with other theories about the clothes. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Soo-jin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to bury him in the local cemetery. And then after that, she did her best to try to move on, but she never could. And as this nightmare kept happening night after night, Soo-jin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. And so Soo-jin basically stopped sleeping, couldn't really eat, certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She actually began to think she was just gonna wither away and die here unless something changed. I mean, this was horrible. She was overcome with grief and sadness and also just scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then on the night of October 18th, 1931, so about 6 months after her son was killed, Soo-jin woke up from yet another nightmare. When she opened her eyes, she saw this shadowy figure at the foot of her bed, and she immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Soo-jin, she wasn't scared. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes, and she actually just began speaking. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Now, Soo-jin really didn't know what she expected to happen here when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have considered, because suddenly the ghost opened their mouth and they spoke. And what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out Chung-soo, Soo-jin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area because he was fearful if he went back home, they would finish the job. They would attack him and kill him. So he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was basically on the run. And so for 6 months, he's living in random towns, doing odd jobs to survive. But eventually, 6 months in, he misses his mom, he misses home, and he goes back and he walks into a room in the middle of the night. He is the ghost. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just says to his mom, "I'm not dead." And he was just being honest. "I'm here, I'm back, I survived." It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who was never identified, by the way, who happened to be in the same area where he had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chung-soo, they're like, "Shoot, that's him, that was us." And they confessed to killing him because that's what they tried to do. They tried to kill him. They didn't kill him. It was some other body. And then when Soo-jin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and he basically looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. And she fixated on his clothes and she was like, "Something's off." Well, she was right. It wasn't her son. It was someone else's clothes. And so in the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chung-soo had their murder charges dropped because they didn't commit a murder. And they were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, they were never identified, and they were buried in a sort of unmarked grave, and the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we're not able to exhume them because we don't know where their grave is. And so very likely, we'll never know who that person was.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.